The sound of clanking tools and the smell of engine grease had been a part of Raymond's life for as long as he could remember. For 30 years, he had worked as a mechanic in the same auto repair shop, his hands fixing countless cars, his face familiar to every customer who walked through the doors. He wasn't just another worker. He was the heart of the place. He had trained younger mechanics, earned the trust of customers, and built a quiet but respected reputation. But one day everything changed. Raymond stood in front of the manager's office, his cap in his hands, confused and shocked. "We appreciate your years of service, but things are changing," the manager had said, avoiding eye contact. "We need fresh talent, new energy. We're letting you go." The words hit him harder than any accident he had ever seen in the garage. Just like that, 3 decades of loyalty were erased. No warning, no appreciation, just a cold, final decision. The younger mechanics exchanged uneasy glances as Raymond walked out, his toolbox in hand. Some whispered among themselves, but no one dared to question the decision. The shop had been under new management for a while now, and the new owner, Zubair, was all about efficiency. In his mind, Raymond was too slow, too outdated. Experience didn't matter to him. He wanted fast work, not careful work. Raymond's wife, Yasmin, was waiting for him at home, expecting him to walk in with his usual tired smile. But when she saw the look on his face, her heart sank. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. "They fired me," he said simply, placing his toolbox on the floor. For the first time in years, their home felt different. The laughter of their grandchildren in the other room, the smell of Yasmin's freshly cooked food, everything seemed distant. He had always been the provider, the strong one. Now he felt lost. Days turned into weeks. Raymond spent his time sitting on the small stool outside his house, staring at the empty road. Some neighbors stopped by, offering words of sympathy, but words didn't pay the bills. His savings were running out. Job hunting at his age was nearly impossible. Who would hire an old mechanic when younger ones worked faster and cheaper? Then, one evening as he sipped his tea, a familiar sound reached his ears, the low, struggling groan of a car engine refusing to start. He turned his head and saw a car parked a few houses away, its owner desperately turning the key in frustration. Without thinking, Raymond set down his cup and walked over. "Need help?" he asked. The young man, clearly frustrated, nodded. "It just stopped working. I have no idea what's wrong." Raymond bent down, his hands moving with the skill of a man who had spent a lifetime doing this. Within minutes, the engine roared back to life. The owner looked at him in amazement. "You fixed it that fast." Raymond just smiled. "Experience." Word spread quickly. Soon more people started showing up at his doorstep with their cars, motorcycles, and even bicycles, asking for help. Raymond's small garage, just a shaded corner of his house, became a local repair spot. He didn't charge much, just enough to keep going. But something inside him felt alive again. Then, one day, something unexpected happened. A black SUV pulled up in front of his house. The windows were tinted, the car polished and new. It was the kind of vehicle that belonged to someone important. The driver stepped out and knocked on Raymond's door. "Are you the mechanic everyone's talking about?" the man asked, his expression unreadable. Raymond hesitated. "I suppose so." The man pulled out an envelope and handed it to him. "Come to the auto shop tomorrow morning. There's something you need to see." Raymond frowned. The auto shop, the same one that had fired him. He felt a strange unease in his chest. Why now? What did they want from him? As the SUV drove away, Yasmin walked up behind him, worry in her eyes. "What's going on?" she asked. Raymond didn't have an answer. He just stared at the envelope in his hands, feeling the weight of something he couldn't yet understand. And the next morning when he walked into the shop, every mechanic, every worker, everyone, stopped what they were doing and stared at him. Raymond stepped through the doorway of the auto shop, his heart pounding in his chest. The place smelled the same, engine oil, metal, and a faint trace of grease in the air. The sounds of tools clanking and engines revving filled the workshop, but something felt different. Everyone had stopped working. Every mechanic, every worker, even the cashier at the front desk had their eyes locked on him. It was as if time had frozen the moment he walked in. He adjusted his cap, trying to keep his face calm. "I got a message to come here," he said, his voice steady but firm. From behind the counter, the new owner, Zubair, appeared. He was a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard and a sharp gaze that could make anyone feel uneasy. Raymond had never liked the way Zubair carried himself, always too confident, too dismissive of the people who had built this place before him. Zubair crossed his arms and studied Raymond for a moment before finally speaking. "So, you actually came," he said, a smirk playing on his lips. "I don't waste time when someone calls me," Raymond replied, keeping his voice neutral. He wasn't here to play games. Zubair chuckled and glanced at the workers, who quickly returned to their tasks, though their ears remained tuned in. "You must be wondering why I called you," he said. Raymond didn't respond. He just waited, watching the younger man carefully. Zubair leaned against the counter. "Ever since you left, things have changed," he admitted, though his tone lacked humility. "We hired new mechanics. Young, fast, efficient. But for some reason, customers started complaining." Raymond raised an eyebrow. "Complaining?" Zubair let out a slow breath, as if saying it out loud was difficult. "They say the repairs don't last. That things break down again too soon. Some even stopped coming altogether. Business has dropped." Raymond felt something stir inside him, something close to satisfaction, but he pushed it away. He wasn't the kind of man to celebrate someone else's failure. "So why call me?" he asked, though he already had a feeling he knew the answer. Zubair hesitated for the first time. "We need you to look at something," he finally said. He motioned for Raymond to follow him to the back of the shop, where a luxury car sat under dim lighting. The hood was open, and two younger mechanics stood beside it, their faces filled with frustration. "This car belongs to an important client," Zubair explained. "We've tried everything, but it won't start. The client is threatening to take his business elsewhere." Raymond could hear the worry in his voice now. It was subtle, buried under his usual arrogance, but it was there. This wasn't just about one car, it was about the shop's reputation. One of the young mechanics, a boy no older than 25, spoke up. "We checked the battery, the fuel system, even replaced a few parts, but nothing's working." His voice carried frustration but also something else, uncertainty. Raymond didn't say anything. He just stepped forward, rolled up his sleeves, and placed his hands on the engine. It was something he had done for years, something that felt as natural to him as breathing. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening, feeling. Then, without a word, he reached for a tool and adjusted a small, nearly invisible connection near the engine's ignition system. Took less than 2 minutes. He stepped back and nodded. "Try it now." The young mechanic hesitated before turning the key. The engine roared to life instantly. The sound echoed through the shop, cutting through the air like a sharp blade. The workers exchanged glances. Some looked impressed. Others looked ashamed. Zubair's face remained unreadable, but Raymond could see the tension in his jaw. He had just done in minutes what Zubair's entire team hadn't been able to do in days. Raymond wiped his hands on a cloth and looked at Zubair. "Experience isn't something you can replace with speed," he said simply. Zubair said nothing for a long moment. Then, in a voice quieter than before, he asked, "How did you know what was wrong?" Raymond shrugged. "I've been fixing cars longer than you've been running this shop. Some things you can't learn from a manual." A silence settled over them. The other workers were watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Zubair finally exhaled and turned toward the other mechanics. "Everyone back to work," he ordered. Then he turned back to Raymond, his eyes calculating. "Come to my office." Raymond hesitated but followed. The office hadn't changed much since the last time he was there. The same wooden desk, the same dusty old fan spinning lazily on the ceiling. But now there were framed certificates on the walls, things Zubair had put up to prove his credentials. Zubair sat behind his desk and gestured for Raymond to take a seat. "I'll be direct," he said. "I want you back." Raymond felt his fingers tighten slightly. He had expected something like this, but hearing it out loud was different. "Why?" he asked, his voice steady. Zubair leaned back. "Because you're good. And because I can't afford to lose more customers." It was an honest answer, but not the one Raymond wanted to hear. He had given this place 30 years of his life. He had poured his sweat into it, built relationships with customers, trained half the men in the shop. And yet, he had been cast aside without a second thought. And now, when things were falling apart, they wanted him back. Raymond looked around the office, his eyes lingering on the old clock on the wall. He had sat in this room so many times before. But this time things were different. He was different. He looked at Zubair, his expression unreadable. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Zubair frowned, as if he hadn't expected hesitation. "Think about it." Raymond stood up. "Yes." He turned and walked out of the office, feeling the eyes of the workers on him once again. But this time he didn't feel out of place. He felt something else, control. As he stepped outside, the evening sun casting long shadows on the pavement, he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over yet. Raymond walked home slowly, his thoughts heavy. The scent of warm evening air mixed with the distant aroma of street food from a vendor nearby, but he barely noticed. His conversation with Zubair replayed in his mind over and over. 30 years of loyalty meant nothing until the shop started failing. Now they wanted him back. But was it really about him or just about saving their business? When he reached home, Yasmin was sitting on the veranda, peeling vegetables for dinner. She looked up, searching his face for answers. "What happened?" she asked softly. Raymond sighed and sat beside her. "They want me back." Yasmin paused, the knife still in her hand. "And I don't know," he admitted. "They didn't respect me when I was there. They threw me out like I was nothing. And now, when they need me, they act like it never happened." Yasmin nodded, understanding his pain. "It's not easy to forgive, especially when the wound is fresh," she said. "But, Raymond, do you still love fixing cars?" He looked at her, her words settling in his heart. Did he? Course he did. He had spent his life under the hood of cars, listening to their silent problems, understanding them when others couldn't. It wasn't just a job, it was a part of him. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, a thought came to him. What if he didn't go back as just another mechanic? What if he returned on his own terms? The next morning he didn't rush to the auto shop. Instead he went to the market, stopping by the small hardware stores and tool shops where he had connections. He asked questions, gathered prices, and made calculations in his head. He visited an empty shop space near the main road and spoke to the owner about rent. When he finally arrived at the auto shop in the afternoon, Zubair was waiting for him. "Took your time," he muttered. "I thought about your offer," Raymond said, his voice steady. "I'll come back, but not as an employee." Zubair frowned. "What does that mean?" Raymond crossed his arms. "I don't need a job. I need respect. If you want me to fix this place, I need my own space in the shop. My own rules. You let me handle things my way, or I walk away." A silence stretched between them. Zubair's jaw tightened, but he knew he had no choice. "Fine," he said at last. "But you prove yourself first." Raymond gave a small nod. "Fair enough." As Raymond walked through the workshop, the younger mechanics watched him with curiosity. Some still held the arrogance of youth, unwilling to admit they needed him. Others, like the boy from yesterday, looked almost relieved. Days passed, and Raymond slowly took control. Customers who had stopped coming returned after hearing he was back. He didn't rush jobs like the others. He listened, examined, and worked with precision. Soon, customers began asking for him by name. One evening, as he wiped the grease off his hands after another long day, he noticed the young mechanic from before. His name was Imran, watching him closely. "What is it?" Raymond asked. Imran hesitated before stepping forward. "Sir, how did you know what was wrong with that luxury car the other day?" Raymond studied the boy's face. There was something there, a hunger to learn. "You have to listen," Raymond said, tapping the side of his head. "Engines talk, but most people don't hear them. They only see problems, not solutions." Imran nodded, absorbing every word. "Can you teach me?" Raymond thought for a moment, then gave a small smile. "Come early tomorrow. Let's see how serious you are." Meanwhile, Zubair watched everything unfold from his office window. He saw how customers greeted Raymond with trust, how the workers respected him in a way they never had for him. He clenched his fists, feeling something he hadn't felt before, fear. If this kept up, Raymond would have more power in the shop than he did. One night, after the shop had closed, Zubair sat in his office, staring at the financial records. His profits had gone up since Raymond returned, but that didn't ease his frustration. He had taken over this shop to make a name for himself, not to be overshadowed by an old mechanic. Just then the door creaked open and a man stepped inside. He was wearing a crisp suit, his hair slicked back. His name was Faisal, an influential businessman known for cutting deals that always benefited him more than the other party. "I heard your business is picking up again," Faisal said smoothly, taking a seat across from Zubair. Zubair nodded, leaning back in his chair. "It is," Faisal smirked. "Because of that old man, right?" Zubair didn't answer. He didn't need to. Faisal continued, his voice low. "You know, it's dangerous to let someone else control your business. You might wake up one day and realize you're not the boss anymore." Zubair's fingers drummed against the desk. He had thought about that. He had seen how the workers looked at Raymond, how the customers trusted him more than they trusted the shop itself. Faisal leaned forward. "You need to remind everyone who really owns this place." Zubair narrowed his eyes. "And how do you suggest I do that?" Faisal chuckled. "There are ways, my friend. Accidents happen. Mistakes are made." Zubair's stomach twisted. He knew what Faisal was implying. But was he willing to go that far? The next morning, when Raymond arrived at the shop, something felt off. The workers were whispering. Even Imran, who had come early as promised, looked nervous. Then he saw it. A damaged car, its windshield shattered, parked right outside the workshop. The owner, an angry man in a suit, was shouting at Zubair. "I brought my car here for a simple fix, and now it's ruined," the man yelled. Zubair, keeping his voice calm, turned toward Raymond. "This was your job, wasn't it?" Raymond's eyes widened. "What? Well, I never worked on this car." Zubair shrugged. "Strange. The records say otherwise." He held up a paper. Raymond's name was signed at the bottom. A cold realization settled over Raymond. This was a setup. The workers exchanged glances. Some looked doubtful. Others avoided his gaze. Raymond clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had to find out the truth. Because this wasn't just about his job anymore. This was war. Raymond stared at the paper in Zubair's hand. His name written at the bottom like a carefully placed trap. A heavy silence filled the workshop, thick with suspicion and doubt. Some of the younger mechanics exchanged uneasy glances, while the older ones, those who had worked with Raymond before, looked uncertain. The furious customer crossed his arms. "I trusted this shop, and now my car is ruined. Who's going to pay for this?" His voice echoed against the metal walls. Raymond took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "I never touched this car," he said, his voice firm. "Someone changed the records." Zubair raised an eyebrow, pretending to look concerned. "Then who did it?" Raymond's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what was happening. Someone was trying to get rid of him, someone who saw him as a threat. And there was only one person who had the most to lose if Raymond stayed. "I don't know," Raymond said slowly, keeping his eyes locked on Zubair. "But I will find out." The customer scoffed. "I don't have time for this nonsense. Either you fix my car or I take this to the police." Zubair let out a dramatic sigh and shook his head. "We'll fix it," he assured the man, then turned to Raymond. "Since this is under your name, you'll handle it." Raymond knew this was another trick. If he agreed, it would be like admitting fault. But refusing would only make him look guilty. He glanced around at the workers. Some were watching with curiosity, others with doubt. He needed to be smart. "I'll fix it," he finally said. "But I want to check the records first." Zubair's eyes flickered with something. Hesitation, maybe even fear, but he quickly masked it. "Fine. But don't waste time." Raymond walked to the office, his pulse steady but his mind racing. He knew Zubair wouldn't make it easy for him to find proof. But if someone had altered the records, there had to be a trail. Inside the office, he opened the logbook, flipping through the pages until he found the entry with his name. The handwriting was neat, almost too neat. His own signature was at the bottom, but something about it felt off. He grabbed an old work order with his actual signature and compared the two. His heart pounded. The difference was small, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. Someone had forged his name. A movement outside the office window caught his eye. Imran stood near the workbench, his face tense. As soon as he saw Raymond looking, he turned away quickly, as if afraid to be caught watching. Raymond narrowed his eyes. Imran had been eager to learn, always watching him work. But had he been watching something else too? Stepping out of the office, he walked over to the young mechanic. "Imran." The boy tensed but didn't turn around. "Look at me." Slowly, Imran faced him, guilt flickering across his face. Raymond lowered his voice. "You saw something, didn't you?" Imran swallowed hard, glancing around nervously. I don't know what you're talking about." Raymond studied him. He was young, scared, caught between loyalty and fear. "If you know the truth and stay quiet, you're just as guilty as the person who did this," he said gently. "But if you speak up, you do the right thing." Imran's hands clenched at his sides. He hesitated, then finally whispered, "I saw Faisal, the man Zubair meets sometimes. He was in the office last night. He had the logbook." Raymond felt a surge of anger but kept his face neutral. "Did you see him change anything?" Imran hesitated, then nodded. "I think so. But I was too scared to say anything." Raymond placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "You did the right thing by telling me now." But deep down, he knew this wasn't enough. He needed real proof. That night, long after the shop had closed, Raymond returned. The streets were quiet. The only sound was the distant hum of the city. He had spent 3 decades in this workshop. He knew its every corner, every weak spot. And he knew that Zubair often kept important papers in his desk drawer. Moving quickly, he slipped through the back entrance and into the office. The darkness made everything feel heavier, like the walls were closing in. He pulled out his phone, using its flashlight to scan the desk. Papers, invoices, but nothing that proved his innocence. Then, his eyes landed on a folder labeled private. He flipped it open. Inside were copies of work orders, all with different signatures, some real, some forged. His own name appeared on multiple documents he had never signed. A sharp sound outside made him freeze. A step. Someone was coming. Raymond's breath caught in his throat. The footsteps were getting closer. He quickly shut the folder and ducked behind the desk, his heart pounding. The door creaked open, and a faint beam of light from a flashlight cut through the darkness. Someone had entered the office. He held his breath, listening. The footsteps were slow, cautious, as if the person knew they weren't alone. Then a familiar voice muttered, "Where is it?" "Zubair." Raymond stayed still, his mind racing. Zubair was looking for something, but what? Was he trying to cover his tracks? The papers were still in the folder. He hadn't had a chance to take them. If Zubair found them now, he'd destroy them for sure. The sound of drawers opening and papers shuffling filled the room. Then a sharp intake of breath. Gone. Zubair's voice was tense. Who took it? Raymond's pulse quickened. Gone. What was missing? He risked a glance from his hiding spot. Zubair was staring at an open drawer. His face twisted in frustration. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Faisal, he whispered harshly. The records. Someone took them. They're not here. Raymond's mind spun. He had just seen the forged documents, but now Zubair was saying they were missing. Someone else had been here before him. Zubair paced the small office, listening to the voice on the other end. No, I don't know who. But if those papers get out, we're finished. Raymond clenched his fists. Finished? What exactly were they hiding? This wasn't just about framing him anymore. There was something bigger at play. Zubair ended the call with a frustrated sigh and stormed out of the office. Raymond waited a few seconds before creeping out of his hiding spot. His mind was racing. If the records were gone, who had taken them? And why? As he left the office, a thought struck him. Run. The boy had seen Faisal with the logbook. Could he have come back, taken the files to protect Raymond? Raymond hurried through the dark streets toward Imran's small house. When he knocked, it took a moment before the door creaked open. Imran peeked out, his eyes wide with fear. Sir, he whispered. Raymond stepped inside quickly, glancing around. The house was dimly lit, the air thick with tension. Imran, he said, keeping his voice calm. Did you take the files? Imran swallowed hard. I didn't know what else to do. Raymond exhaled, relieved. Where are they? The boy hesitated, then walked to a small cupboard and pulled out a folder. I was scared. I thought if I had them, they couldn't blame you anymore. Raymond opened the folder. The same forged documents were inside, along with additional records, paperwork that had nothing to do with him. His eyes scanned over numbers, transactions, and names he didn't recognize. Then suddenly it all clicked. This wasn't just about framing him. Zubair and Faisal were hiding something much bigger. Imran, he said slowly. These aren't just work records. This is money laundering. The boy's eyes widened. What? Raymond flipped through the papers. It was all here. Fake transactions, altered invoices, money that had never gone into the shop but had been recorded as payments. Zubair had been using the shop as a front for something else. And when Raymond came back, bringing customers and attention with him, it became a problem. They had to get rid of him. A sudden noise outside made them both jump. A car screeched to a stop near the house. Raymond rushed to the window and peered through the curtains. Two men stepped out, their faces partially hidden by the shadows. One of them was Faisal. Raymond turned to Imran. They know you have the files. Imran's face paled. What do we do? Raymond grabbed the folder. We can't stay here. We have to go now. But before they could move, there was a loud knock at the door. Imran, a voice called out smoothly. We know you're in there. Open the door. It was Zubair. Imran's hands trembled as he looked at Raymond. His breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The knocks grew louder, more forceful. Imran. Zubair's voice came again, this time sharper. We know you have something that doesn't belong to you. Open the door and we can talk. Raymond glanced around the small house, searching for a way out. The back door, if they moved fast enough, they could slip out unnoticed. But just as he took a step toward it, the doorknob rattled. They're coming in, Imran whispered. Raymond knew they couldn't afford to panic. He grabbed Imran's arm and pulled him toward the back door, pushing it open as quietly as possible. But just as they stepped outside, a car engine roared to life. Headlights flashed, illuminating them like a spotlight. There they are. Faisal's voice cut through the night. Without thinking, Raymond shoved the folder into Imran's hands. Run! Imran hesitated, fear flickering in his eyes. What about you? Go! Raymond urged. Find someone you trust. Don't stop until you do. Imran clenched the folder to his chest and bolted down the narrow alley. Raymond turned just as Faisal and another man lunged toward him. He dodged, but not fast enough. One of them grabbed his arm, yanking him back. Where's the file? Faisal growled. Raymond smirked despite the tight grip on his arm. Gone. Faisal's expression darkened. You just made this harder for yourself. Before Raymond could react, a fist slammed into his stomach, knocking the wind out of him. He stumbled but refused to fall. He had survived 30 years in this world. He wasn't going down now. Then, from a distance, the wail of a police siren pierced the air. Faisal and his men froze. Raymond blinked in surprise. Had Imran managed to get help that fast? The car screeched to a halt nearby, and uniformed officers jumped out, guns drawn. Hands in the air. Faisal hesitated for a second too long. The police moved in, grabbing him and his men before they could escape. As Zubair was shoved toward a patrol car, his furious eyes locked onto Raymond. You think this is over, he spat. You have no idea what you've done. Raymond shook his head. No, Zubair. You have no idea what you did. You betrayed the shop. You betrayed the people who trusted you. And now it's over. As the officers cuffed Zubair and Faisal, another car pulled up. Imran stepped out, his face still pale but determined. Beside him was the customer whose car had supposedly been ruined, the very man Zubair had used to frame Raymond. I called the police, Imran admitted. I gave them the file. The customer stepped forward. I saw the documents. I know the truth now. I'm sorry for doubting you. Raymond exhaled, the weight of months of suspicion and injustice lifting from his shoulders. As the police cars drove away, Imran looked up at him. What now? Raymond smiled, the first real smile in a long time. Now we rebuild. The next morning, the workshop doors opened as usual. Only this time, it wasn't under Zubair's rule. The workers, the customers, even the city itself knew. Raymond was back, and the shop would be better than ever. The sun cast a golden glow over the workshop as Raymond stood at the entrance, taking in the sight before him. The air smelled of grease and metal, just as it always had, but today there was something different, a feeling of hope. The workers had gathered around, their faces filled with anticipation. 4 years they had worked under Zubair's control, too afraid to speak up, too uncertain of what the future held. But now things had changed. Imran stood beside Raymond, his hand still gripping the strap of his tool bag like he wasn't sure if he belonged here. Raymond gave him a reassuring nod. You're one of us now, he said. This place isn't just a workshop. It's a family. And in a family, we look out for each other. The boy's eyes shone with something close to pride. He had risked everything by telling the truth, and now he had found a place where he was truly valued. The other workers murmured among themselves, unsure of what came next. One of the older mechanics, Aslam, stepped forward. What happens now, Ustad? Raymond smiled at the title. He hadn't been called that in a long time. He glanced around at the garage, at the cars waiting to be repaired, at the people who had been waiting for someone to lead them. We get back to work, he said simply. The tension in the air eased, and slowly, the workers moved back to their stations. Tools clinked, engines revved, and the shop came back to life. Raymond rolled up his sleeves and walked to the nearest car, a familiar feeling settling in his chest. This was where he belonged. As he worked, customers started arriving. Word had already spread. Raymond was back, and the shop was no longer under Zubair's control. One by one, people returned, some shaking his hand, some simply watching as he worked, knowing they could trust him. The customer whose car had been used in the setup arrived as well, a guilty look on his face. I just wanted to say, I should have listened to you. I was quick to believe the worst. Raymond wiped his hands on a cloth and shook his head. What matters is that the truth came out in the end. The man nodded. If it means anything, I'll make sure people know this shop is in good hands. As the day went on, things started to feel normal again. But as the sun began to set, a familiar face appeared at the edge of the workshop. Raymond straightened as he saw his old friend, Ahmad, standing there. Ahmad had been the only one to warn him when Zubair turned against him, but after everything that happened, they had lost touch. Ahmad stepped forward, his expression unreadable. I heard what happened. Raymond nodded. It's over now. Ahmad studied him for a moment, then let out a chuckle. You always did have a way of coming back stronger. Raymond laughed, shaking his head. I didn't do it alone. He glanced at Imran, at the workers, at the shop that now felt alive again. And I won't run this place alone either. Ahmad patted his shoulder. Then you're doing it right. As the night settled in, Raymond sat outside the workshop, watching the streetlights flicker on. He had spent 30 years in this place, and for a while, he thought it had been taken from him. But now he realized something important. It had never been about the shop itself. It was about the people, the work, and the trust that came with it. Imran joined him, sitting on the step with a thoughtful expression. Do you think Zubair and Faisal will try to come back? Raymond exhaled. Maybe. But they won't have the power they once did. Their lies caught up to them. And if they do come back, they'll find that this place is stronger than before. Imran nodded, seeming to take comfort in the words. Then after a pause he said, I want to learn from you. Not just fixing cars but everything. How to run a shop, how to do things the right way. Raymond looked at the boy, seeing a reflection of himself from years ago. Young, eager and searching for a path. He placed a firm hand on Imran's shoulder. Then you're in the right place. The night air was cool, and for the first time in a long time, Raymond felt at peace. The workshop was his again, not just as a place to work, but as a place to build something lasting. As the lights inside the shop flickered off one by one, he stood up, stretching his tired muscles. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, but he was ready. Because no matter what happened next, one thing was certain. Raymond had returned, and this time he wasn't going anywhere.